Hi class. So you've completed the modules on human development. There is a good deal of information across those modules. And of course that's modules 13, 14, 15, and 16. So some things I'm going to hit on in these modules include Piaget's theory, include Erikson's theory, and Kohlberg's theory. Starting with Piaget, a little bit about each of his stages, what the child reasoning is like in each of the stages. So now you know in the sensory motor stage that children are learning an association between their sensations and motor behaviors. So they're learning, for example, if they're sitting in a high chair and they have a spoon and they drop the spoon like this, and somebody comes along and picks them up, that they can make the person do that again. So if a child does something like this and is very amused and is laughing about this behavior, it's because they're making that kind of association. So basically they're learning through their sensations and their motor behavior. Okay? As far as something that's important in the stage that develops, it is the concept of object permanence, and that means that the child now understands even if they can't see something, it still exists. So that object is permanent. Object permanence is very important for the development of attachment. The child has to have the idea that the primary caregiver still exists even when that primary caregiver cannot be seen. Okay? So object permanence also is important for the idea of representational thought. The child is now able to imagine the primary caregiver and imagine other objects even though he or she can't see those people or objects. Okay? And that's where you get representational thought. As related to the pre-operational stage, you have the continuation of development of representational thought. And as far as the reasoning in this stage, it is very kind of simplistic. It's based on individual events, so children are not able to make connections across events. The child is very egocentric in this stage. It is very difficult for the child to understand somebody else's point of view, somebody else's perspective. Okay? So here's where the child may be looking at a picture that he or she drew, and if they're on the phone with somebody else, let's say grandma, that child can't understand that grandma is unable to see that photo, because if the child can see it, everybody can see it. So egocentrism is not the belief that they are the center of the universe, the greatest person to exist. It's really a simplistic can't take another person's point of view. As far as the reasoning, it's also very inflexible. So if a child gets an idea in their head, it is very difficult to change that idea, change that thought. And finally, animism is something that characterizes the child's thought during this stage. In other words, the child thinks that non-living objects are alive. So here's where the child would get very upset if their favorite action figure were broken, because they would think that that action figure actually experiences pain. So that's pre-operational stage. Moving to the concrete operational stage, cue in on that term concrete. The child is very good in their reasoning as long as they can be provided with a physical example, as long as you can show them. So think of how children are taught how to add. They're shown a picture of 3 objects, and then the plus sign, and then 1 object, so you have a 3 plus 1. The child can point to each object and count them all up, and ooh, there's 4, right? But you have to show the child, okay? That's concrete operations. Child now has a understanding of reversibility in your text that's called mathematical transformations. Essentially, what that means is the child now understands that if 3 plus 2 is 5, then 5 minus 2 is 3. So they can go back and forth in their operations, and that's reversibility. And they also have the concept of conservation, so they now understand that you can change the shape of something, but that doesn't mean that the actual amount changes, and that's the idea of conservation. Finally, Piaget's stages, the last stage is formal operations, and this is complete abstract thought. The idea behind the stage is that, of course, people enter this stage, but their reasoning becomes more and more complex throughout life. So just because a person may enter formal operations, let's say at 13 years old, okay, that doesn't mean that they're done developing cognitively. Okay? Their thought process becomes more and more complex. So that's Piaget. Take home points from him. Going to Erikson. Erikson had his psychosocial stages of development, the lifespan approach. So his stages applied from cradle to grave. In his stages, envision in each of the 8 stages, there's a conflict and a crisis. The conflict is the pull that occurs throughout each stage. So for trust versus mistrust, for example, there's a pull to trust others or mistrust others. And that occurs throughout the entire stage. That's the conflict. The crisis occurs at the end of the stage, and envision the crisis as a turning point. This is where, in essence, the individual is making a decision to which route they're going to go. So are they going to go trust, or are they going to go mistrust? And then they move on to the next stage, having gone either trust or mistrust. They'll move to the next stage in any case. As far as something else for Erikson's theory to consider, it is who influences the resolution of each stage. As far as remember, the stages are called the psychosocial stages. So you have social entities as influencing the resolution of each stage. And a way to remember this is that for his early stages, especially when you talk about trust versus mistrust, when you talk about autonomy versus shame and doubt, and initiative versus guilt, it's the primary caregivers and how they treat the child that affects the resolution of each stage. For the industriousness versus inferiority, that's the school age years, you still have primary caregivers, but you also have now teachers become very important in the resolution of each stage. And then finally, in the last 4 stages, it's the individual himself or herself who's most important as far as resolving the stage. So my last take-home point focuses on Kohlberg's stages of moral development. If you break it down, he has pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. It's actually a little more complex than that, but that works for us. For pre-conventional, think moral reasoning is affected by what's going to happen to me. Will I get punished for a given behavior? Okay? So a behavior is moral if I will not get punished. It's immoral if I will get punished. For conventional, think of conventions, think of rules, think of social norms. So if most people do it, it's okay. If it's legal, it's okay. If it's illegal, then it must be immoral. So following conventions. For post-conventional, that's when morals are really internalized. So of course society will still have an influence, but the person really makes their own call as far as what they consider moral and immoral behavior. So those are my take-home points for the human development modules. I will see you for the next modules.